The real miracle in Chile was not that those economic reforms worked so well. Chile is by all odds the best success story in Latin America today.
Und insofern werden wir Wege finden, wie die parlamentarische Mitbestimmung so gestaltet wird, dass sie trotzdem auch marktkonform ist.
Sigue día a día anotándose nuevas victorias sobre el imperialismo.
Pošast trga, podkast o kapitalizmu, državi in alternativah.
Great. So, hello to everybody and welcome to the newest episode of the podcast named Spectre of the Market. Today, we will be turning away from Ireland. In the last episode, I hosted Professor Sean Ryan and we discussed some features of the past and the present developments in politics and economy in Ireland. And today we will move to the second, or that is the third country that I'm focusing on in my research, and that is Portugal. And that is the reason why I invited today Dora Fonseca to be my guest and to discuss together some specific characteristics of Portuguese development. But before we move on, I would just like to introduce Dora. She holds a PhD in sociology and is a researcher at the Colabor, that is the Collaborative Laboratory for Labor, Employment and Social Protection in Portugal, which is actually a sort of NGO think tank and research organization. And it brings together resources from academia, companies, and public administration with a specific view of gleaning a more in-depth understanding of the present and foreseeable problems in the three crucial areas, and that is work and employment, social protection, and solidarity. And her main research areas, and that is why I invited her today, are actually industrial relations and collective bargaining. So, Dora, thank you for your time and welcome.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So it's really a pleasure to talk about my favorite topics, about my research. So I'm open to all your questions and everything you want to talk about.
Great, thank you. So when we discussed how to proceed with this discussion, this talk, I proposed you some topics, and I think it's good to not to stick to them exactly, but to follow this historical perspective that was proposed, and that means that we'll, before turning to the present, we'll go a bit to the past, because I believe that in order to understand what is going on in Portugal or also elsewhere in the field of industrial relations, employment, work, economy as general, it is crucial also to understand what was before that. And Portugal had a very difficult time a decade ago, or even 15 years ago, when the big crisis began, the financial and economic crisis, the global crisis, which had a very specific impact on Portugal. And maybe we can begin with discussing this aspect. Could you maybe reflect on the main reasons for this big crisis? What were the main reasons, and why did this global crisis affect Portugal so much in this aspect, in the economic sense, but also in this societal aspect, because it had also very negative social outcomes, this crisis in Portugal?
Okay. There are two sets of factors that have limited Portugal's capacity to react to the crisis in 2008, to the beginning of the crisis. So if we look into Portugal's path through the last decades, we see a country that was not mildly developed, but had a weak industry or underdeveloped industry that relied a lot in in agriculture, but not in agriculture like we see in perhaps Brazil or Argentina, that is based on large fields and large production. So we're talking about small fields and small production, familiar production, and based also in fishing and stuff like that. And we're talking about underdeveloped industry. We're talking about underdeveloped economic. Also, we're talking about a country that in 1986 joined the European Union, and all the countries that joined the European Union were subjected to a number of constraints related to their capacity of decision regarding their macroeconomic politics, their orientation towards unemployment and wages and all that. Not specifically because the defining wages was and still is something that regards the country and their internal politics, but there are levels, there are constraints regarding budgets and all that. So their Portugal capacity to decide and to think about new politics to react to the crisis was very constrained in 2008. Its capacity to finance itself in the markets was very constrained. So Portugal hands were tied to find solutions, and that was a very big handicap in that situation. And of course, the internal factors of underdeveloped or low productivity economy with high unemployment, not very high, but all the same, not very low unemployment, and with high levels of precariousness and very low wages comparing to other European countries. So there are a number of factors, and also regarding competencies, the skills of the working population, there are some décalage regarding other countries like Germany and so on. So there is a mismatch regarding the skills needed for certain jobs and the skills detained by the graduates and so on. So a number of factors combined resulted in a low capacity to react to the crisis in 2008.
Great, very interesting to hear this. Especially the aspect that yes, because many people think that the EU does not have a direct impact on how countries cope with these industrial relations field, but of course it had an important agenda setting and framework setting with budgetary constraints, Maastricht criteria, and so on. And in this sense, maybe before we address the Troika period, I believe it should be also address the period before the Troika entered Portugal, and that was in 2011. So before this, so from 2008, 2009 until 2011, also some important changes began occurring. And the reason why I want to discuss is because when I talk to colleagues from Portugal, they many times fail to see that austerity measures had been introduced also prior to Troika, and it was and especially they do not like to reflect on the role of the socialist government that was in place at that time. So it was not only the PSD when it took power and the Troika came in 2011 that the austerity period began. It was also before that, and when you also mentioned the role of the EU, in this sense, of course, it is important to know that Portugal, as also some other countries, attempted to introduce some neo-Keynesian policies in 2008-9, especially 2009. It was also in case in Slovenia with some layoff mechanisms, short-time work, and so on. Portugal had some other policies, but the idea was not to go into austerity. However, that changed rapidly, and the socialists were also one of the key. Socialist Party and the socialist government was actually one that began with that policy. That then the Troika and the PSD went even deeper and further, of course. But maybe your reflections on that period and this important thing, I believe.
Okay, I see your point. Okay, so in 2009, when the whole story started, we had indeed a socialist government in Portugal with absolute majority. That's odd. That's not odd, but okay, that's a special thing. And the first proto-austerity measures were introduced during that socialist government. That's true because that's 2000. The period from 2009 onwards was when the first bubbles and the first budgetary constraints and the first inflation period started all around Europe, and the socialist government had the need to apply some measures to try to stop it a little bit. And also in 2009, we had the labor code, the reformulation of the labor code that introduced some new articles or changed the articles, the laws, some specific laws that were paramount to our bargaining system. And they were much worse to workers than those that existed before, namely law articles that had to do with after effect of the collective agreements, their survival clause, and their validity, and regarding the number, the maximum number of short-term, fixed-term contracts and stuff like that. So these are the first things that we have to underline to say that stop. It was a socialist government, but it had serious problems towards the workers' interests. That's true. And then we had stability and growth pacts that were packages of measures to contain the damage of the economy, and it proposed measures that were tremendously damaging for the working class, and especially to public servants. So we had the cut of the 10% of the wages for public servants. We had several things regarding the 10%, more things. I can't recall all, but it was very damaging. And these were austerity measures, undercover austerity measures. So it all began during the PS government, majority government. And the big blow, it was in 2010, 2011, and that was the PS government of José Sócrates, the same that was ruling in 2009, and the public debt was uncontainable, and he had to renounce because he called the Troika. So the PS government, yes, he was in power, and the austerity began before, and some of the measures, and before that there was a social how can I translate this? Do acordo de concertação social. Social consultation agreement.
Yes.
That is an agreement that is signed between the government and the social partners. The social partners are the trade union confederations and the employers confederations. So we have 4 employers confederations in Portugal and 2 trade union confederations. Normally, the CGTP, that is the biggest one, and traditionally communist orientated. The other one is the UGT, that is social democratic. The CGTP never signs any agreement. So, and this agreement already had some measures that were alike the measures that were going to be adopted during the Troika period. So there were measures that were already rolling. And so austerity was already going on in Portugal before 2011.
Yes. Great. Yes. I mean, it's not something that I think that is crucial to understand, but it is important because also in Slovenia, at that time, we had a social democratic government, actually, which is something that this party developed after the breakup of Yugoslavia and of the League of Communists of Slovenia. So it was a successor and allegedly a left party, but of course they also were the ones who began introducing austerity measures. Of course, it was not something that they purely wished for, but it was this European context that was pushing them and everybody else.
Yes.
A very specific framework. So when we get to 2011, there is an important change in Portugal, and also because of 2 reasons. One is that the PSA government stepped down and the PSD won the elections and the Troika enters. What were the major and most important decisions taken up by the Troika, and what were the effects on society, especially not only on the economy as such, but on society after during this Troika period?
Okay, the Troika period, beginning the official Troika period beginning in 2011 in March, it was a very dark period, very dark, black period for the Portuguese society, and it was in one word, desperation. All that you knew until then disappeared. We had the majority of the society was plunged into a great crisis. So middle classes almost disappeared. The layers with low incomes were in desperation to find ways of surviving. Numbers of employment were unbelievable. I can say that, for instance, our unemployment rate in 2008 was 7.6. In 2011, it raised to 13.4. In 2013, it raised to 17.1. So you can see how it went. It was unbelievable. Public servants were especially hit by the crisis also. Youth unemployment was unbelievable too. The rates mounted until 30 point something. So, and measures there was a cut in all social support measures. For instance, social income that was available for the poor ones. wages were cut, the holiday benefits were cut by half, the Christmas benefits bonus was cut by half, they cut the number of days of holidays, they cut wages, they changed collective bargaining rules, they suspended let me think the name in English, extension ordinances, that we use extension ordinances in Portugal because of the low coverage of the low affiliation rate of employers to the confederations and the low density of trade union membership of trade union organizations. So in order to have a big coverage of the collective bargaining agreements, yes. And all those measures transformed our industrial relations system and changed the rules of the game regarding employment. So the quality of employment, there was a degradation of the quality of employment, and for instance, the working hours raised for public servants raised from 35 to 40. That is unbelievable. And a series of changes, a number of changes were very, very bad for the working class. And the quality of life in Portugal was very bad. The downgraded, absolutely. So there was a dissemination of the idea of inevitability, that there was no choice. So, Tina, there is no alternative, like in the Thatcher years. That was the government's speech, that we had to conform to those facts because we had no alternative. There was no other way to solve the crisis. And that was the European Union's, the Commission's discourse also. So people at first, they just remained set at home and complied to the rules of the game. But instantly, there were a number of social movement organizations and other players from the civil society that started to contest the discourses of this governmental discourse, saying that no, there's other way. We can change that. This isn't fair. We are not the ones. We are not the pigs. We were not living above our possibilities, because that was the European Union speech, that the South Europeans were living above their possibilities. Yes. So, and also the trade union movement was not so much. Both trade union organizations, the confederations, were against the measures. Of course, the CGTP, the communist-oriented one, was much more critical. Its criticism was more powerful towards the measures than the UGT, so the social democratic one. But both were against it, and thought that the politics that were forward were leading Portugal to a natural disaster, that it wasn't they were destroying the middle classes, and the middle classes were the ones consuming, were the consumers that put the economy, the dynamics of the economy rolling. So there was a big problem emerging, and you started to see more and more people depending on social services, on social NGOs giving them food to survive. And that was a general picture of social and economic crisis in Portugal.
Yeah, so it was a huge devastation. And as you mentioned, it was interesting to see that from these three countries that I'm focusing on, Slovenia, Ireland, and Portugal, Portugal had the strongest backlash against austerity, and also had the strongest formal, that is trade union, backlash against austerity with the general strikes, etc. Although there is a cleavage between the CGTP and UGT, as we know. But it's interesting to see that, because in Ireland there was almost none, especially none in the form of trade union attempt to fight against austerity. And in Slovenia it was also very, very mild, and at the end they even self-imposed some austerity just to stay at the table, which is also something that in the end happened in Portugal. But this trade union dynamics was something that stood out in this picture for me.
Let me say that trade union activity was very, very important during those years, and their opposition to the austerity dynamics and the austerity measures and austerity discourse was paramount. And there are very interesting elements regarding trade union activity. One element, the dynamics between the two trade union confederations. We had the two confederations joining forces to call for general strikes. That was unbelievable. Okay. Another interesting point. We had trade union confederations and trade unions joining forces with social movements in mass demonstrations. That's another interesting point, because traditionally organized action is separate from informal collective action. So
yes.
More interesting elements. The resorting to several, I think there were 5 general strikes in Portugal.
Yes.
It's very much. There were more general strikes in 4 years than in 40 years of democratic rule. Okay? Yes. 4 for 5th. There was a European general strike. That's another key moment in all this process. There was, and the demands that were present in the general strikes, the demands for we against them, the populist logics here. There are several things that we have to pay attention, because it's an incredible moment of mobilization. And those who thought that trade unions were dead, they proved it was a life proof during the austerity period. And I think they were key in pressuring the government. They stood back. The government stood back in certain measures. There was a key measure that was the taxa social única, social tax, single social tax. They wanted to apply a single social tax to in all individuals except for companies and big companies and all that. And it was another tax that they wanted to create. And they stood back because there was a huge general strike. So you see the pressure that citizens and trade unions were able to apply. So these were key moments during this period.
Yes, and before we move to the period after this great crisis in Portugal, you also focused in your research on the social movements in Portugal during this time, and I believe that this is something very important to address, because when I compare Portugal to Slovenia, there was, as I said, the trade union aspect was pretty mild in opposing austerity, but there was a big mobilization within civil society, so to say, and with different social movements against austerity. And also from these social movements, even some new parties emerged in Slovenia in the aftermath. For example, the left, which was the outcome of these protests against austerity at that time. And it is also interesting for me, and that's something that I want to ask you, what is the connection? Is there any connection between the impact of the social movement in Portugal with the post-2015 rise of the more radical left in Portugal, in Portuguese politics and party arena?
Not radical, no, not radical left. Unfortunately, it's more radical right in Portugal right now.
Okay.
Because we have a more leftish wing in Portugal. That it's the left bloc that is several left parties. More radical left parties that were formed during the revolution in the 70s something, but there were no left parties that formed during, but yes, I think not relevant ones, but in the latest years, there is a new party on the scene, not so new right now, that succeeded to enter the parliamentary arena, and is Chega, that admires Viktor Orban and stuff like that. And what's the name of the guy, the Italian guy? Salvini and Le Pen. And, so in terms of left parties, that there was no impact or big impact. But in the 2015 elections, the left parties succeeded in having a good votation turnout, yes. So, and one of the results was that the PS didn't get the absolute majority, but the Free Together, the Communist Party, or better said, the CDU, that's the coalition of the Communist Party and the Greens, and the Left Bloc and PS together, the Free Together, got the absolute majority, and they got the government. They formed the government, and they were able to put the PSD away. So
that was still an important aspect.
Yes, the contraption. We called it the contraption. It was a PS minority government supported by the CDU, by the Communist Party and the Left Bloc.
Yes. And what was the impact of the Communist and the Left Bloc during this period? So from 2015 until when did they stop supporting the PS?
Yeah, in 2022. Yes, when the
new elections were held.
Yes. Okay.
So 7 years. What was the impact of these more? Let's say, I suppose that it ought to be that the Communists and the Left Bloc are more to the left from the Socialists, or am I wrong?
Are more to the left than the Socialists, of course, yes. Yeah. The Socialists are more social democratic, of course, and the social democratic are more rightish.
Yes.
They were a bit like the policemen of the Socialist Party, and they were there like to always remember them, to stick to the agreement that was signed, or that it was talked about before the after the elections. So they were there to remember them, that there was a number of priorities regarding social policy and restituting wages and social benefits to citizens. That's the things that were taken away during the Troika years. So they were like the Socialist Party policemen during the government, the PS minority government. It was their role, and it was an important role because PS it's not really leftish.
Yes,
it's more to left than the PSD. That's for sure, but some it has. We must remember that whatever government is in place has to comply to certain EU directives, to certain budgetary constraints, to certain policies, and there is always an attraction to power and to middle terms. So we need some counterbalance, someone to make us stick to the objectives.
Of course, yes. Well, this is interesting that you say, because the one would expect, of course, that the socialists themselves also went through some sort of catharsis, so to say, or self-inspection as to the period when they were introducing austerity, and that they also attempted to move at least slightly more to the left, because in Slovenia, the Social Democrats, for example, they really did not do any sort of self-reflection and self-inspection, and they still stick to the Blairity third way politics, which is actually very limited in terms of being left, But of course, because also in Slovenia, as you explained for Portugal, it's interesting to see how, for example, today the left, which, as I said, emerged after the big social mobilization during the crisis, actually is playing this role that you explained for the communists and the left bloc in that period. So they are actually the left is actually in the government, not only supporting the government, but they have very limited power. They're only really focusing that the government does not do too much damage, so to say, social damage, but nothing more than that, actually.
I was thinking about the previous question about the left parties emerging from the mobilizations, and yes, we didn't have a thing like Podemos. No, we didn't have. No. We had strong social movements
or something. Yes,
we had interesting things like petition that was put in circulation by a social movement, and that petition would gave rise to citizens' legislative initiative that afterwards gave rise to a law that was voted in the parliament, but not to a party. And it was a law regarding precariousness and fixed term contracts and self-employed people, stuff like that.
Okay, that's also an important aspect, of course, of this entire period. And now we come to the 2019, 2020, the time when the socialists were in power, together with the more left support from the two parties, or the two political structures. and then the COVID-19 pandemic comes. What was its impact in Portugal, and how did you see this government? Because it's also interesting to compare the 2008-9 socialist response to the crisis with this one, this response to the crisis, because some important differences. We can say that there are important differences, but then again, the entire framework changed. The European framework also changed in this decade.
Yeah. Regarding the response, I would say that it was not very bad, not at all. For instance, I've got the employment numbers right in front of me, and in 2020 we had 7.0 of unemployment. In 2021, 6.6, and in 2022, 6.0. So there was no rising in employment during the pandemics. That is to say that the measures applied by the government to contain unemployment and bankruptcies and stuff like that, and how do you say when a company, I'm missing the term in English, when
which one?
Fails, the company fails. Bankrupts, okay. The measures applied and created by the government had some level of efficacy and, well, were appropriate to sustain, to contain the effects of the pandemics. So in a certain way, we could say that comparing to other countries and seeing the level, the numbers of deaths and all that, and of recovery and all that, that we the way the government managed it was not bad. Yes. I would say it was not bad at all.
Yeah,
of course, yes. We still see that many people has struggled to keep their homes, to have some bread to eat, and that but really many relied on civil society organizations to make it through. But I think that a lot did a lot worse. So
yes,
let's be fair.
Of course, it could be much worse. Yes, it's actually very interesting to see how these unemployment figures actually went down during the COVID and not up as it was expected. It was not only in Portugal but also.
Let's see, because there are certain sectors that were essential sectors for the functioning of life and of the economy during the COVID period that had to go on, and I'm sure that in those sectors that levels of employment compensated for the levels of unemployment during the COVID-19. But these numbers are not very specific, so I couldn't say for sure in which sectors the things went better and which sectors went worse. But I would say that it's in terms of in general, it was not very bad. But for instance, in the tourism sector, the losses were incredible. And for that, there were specific support measures created that were not at all sufficient to contain the effects, but helped in some way, because there were support measures for everything. And even incentives for companies that didn't fire people, that didn't resort to collective dismissals, and that whatever, for many things. So in order to make companies believe they would succeed and to keep their workers. So,
yes, and maybe your reflection on the issue that we already discussed, and that is the elections that were held, and when the socialists emerged as the victors, or as they managed to form the government alone without the communist and the left bloc. Did that have any impact, or could one say that now that there are no policemen of the socialists within, they don't need them? Did this?
Oh, they need them. They need them.
They need them still. Okay.
They still need them, of course. And there are a succession of scandals right now. Yes. Problems with ministers and that are unbelievable. It sounds like Antonio Costa is a beginner, and that's not true because he's very experienced. But they need it, yes. And the Portuguese people is extremely, strangely relaxed right now because there is no mobilization. I think it's summertime. That's the reason why. But yeah, policemen are needed. They are always needed. Yes. But we'll see. We'll see, because we have right now with certain professions, with certain sectors, for instance, professors, teachers. Yes. We have right now a huge problem with the teachers, huge mobilization, because their careers, that's one of the effects of Troika, careers were stagnated. The progression of careers of public servants' careers and teachers and all that in the public sector were stagnated during the Troika. And they lost something like 6 years and 6 months and 23 days of that should be counted to make it of service time to progress. And they are demanding that the government finds a way to count that time. Yes. As something to make the progression in terms of career. And they are mobilizing in mass demonstrations, in strikes for about a year. And it's a very controversial question, because at the same time, while they strike, they interrupt exams, teaching time and all that. So it's a question also of public opinion. Yes. Towards the legitimacy of this struggle, a way of struggle. And the socialist government is like death, totally death towards their demands. Nothing. So we'll see. Yes. How it goes, but and I'm speaking of teachers, but there's other sectors that have demands. For instance, in the railways workers also are striking a lot this year, and the public opinion is furious because they buy their tickets for the whole month, and they don't have trains to displace themselves to work. Okay, so there's a certain tension in the air. Yes, and but the opposition also is not very credible. The PST opposition, because their leader is I think it's a little bit of a fool, you know. So we'll see what happens.
Yes, interesting.
Controversial.
Interesting predictions. The autumn and winter could get more intense after the summer.
Yeah.
Okay, and at the end, maybe to reflect on some issues and changes that occurred in Portugal, but are also part of the broader EU framework, the introduction of the decent work agenda, and also some changes to the labor law that were made, also because of the pandemic, but also because of some other developments. Maybe your reflections on that, because there are also some changes in Slovenia that are going on, and it would be interesting to hear and maybe to compare these processes.
Regarding these changes, there's a lot going on. Okay, some changes, and there are two that I think they're quite important. One, I didn't reflect a lot about it, but it is a direct consequence of the pandemics, and is related to telework. The law has changed because a lot of telework was done during the pandemics. So the government, because there was a lot of buzz of noise regarding telework, it was insufficiently ruled in the labor code. For instance, there was no ruling regulation about who owned the means of production, that is the computer, and who paid it for the internet and all that. There were some changes in the labor code to secure all that for the worker, the expenses, the electricity expenses, and all those things. Because if you are working from your home, you have the employer has no expenses with the office, but you have with your home, with your place. Okay, that's one change that is important. Under the decent work agenda, that was framed as one big challenge of the Socialist Party, was announced as a great accomplishment, as a trophy of the government.
Yes,
it was. I was a bit disillusioned with it. There are some advancements, however. Not everything is bad. And there is two articles that I think are super important regarding the consequences for workers and for collective bargaining, I think. That is Article 10A and 12A. Article 10A has to do with collective representation and collective bargaining, and it grants rights of collective representation and bargaining to independent workers, economically dependent. So, if you are an independent worker, self-employed, but you are economically dependent, you have rights to be unionized, and you have rights to be encompassed by a collective agreement.
Okay, yeah, that's important.
And it grants you more security. But the trick is that you have to notify your employer.
Okay.
And that's.
And then they can fire you or stop collaborating.
That's a reality of the thing. So it puts you in a very awkward, insecure position. So I anticipate some problems with that.
Yes.
And I also anticipate some problems with trade union organizations. I anticipate that members might feel not attacked, but a little bit insecure with this openness to their resources by people from outside that don't pay the quotes, don't pay every month to be a member. Because if you because you can be part of the you can be encompassed by, you also can be encompassed by the collective agreement without being a member of the collective of the trade union. So that's a bit odd, you know. And the thing is that traditionally you had to be a salaried wage worker to be part of a trade union. So there are certain difference in terms of interests, and that introduces some segmentation inside the trade union, and it also might introduce some segmentation inside the collective bargaining agreements. So it has yet to be seen how is it going to be put in reality. I have some expectations. I feel a bit awkward about it. I don't know. I feel that there might be tensions amongst members. I feel like it might generate tensions about trade union officials.
Yes.
It won't be easy because. And the other article, it's the 12A, and regulates the subordination. Work contract presumption for platform workers. Okay. So it regulates under what conditions you are considered. There's a subordination presumption, and you are considered a wage worker, okay, yes, a dependent worker of the platform, and that's a good thing. And there are several criteria that have to be considered, and if you fill those criteria, you are platform a worker, a salaried a worker. You should have a contract with the platform.
Of course.
And that grants you rights. It grants you social security rights. It grants you wage security rights. It grants you several things, and it grants you collective bargaining rights. The thing is, once again, how is it going to work? Are you going to be? Is it your collective bargaining agreement be independent collective bargaining agreement just for platform workers? For platform workers, for instance, ride-hailing platform workers, okay, or food delivery for platform workers? Or B, are you going to be integrated in a collective bargaining agreement, general collective bargaining agreement for that for the sector, okay, with no specification, so a general collective agreement for the delivery sector? Or C, are you going to be integrated in a collective agreement of the sector, but with an article specific for platform workers?
Yes.
So how are we going to manage this? There are several questions that we should think that can put some tension inside the system, the collective bargaining system, and inside the trade unions themselves.
Yes, well, it's interesting also that you were mentioning these platform workers and the problems surrounding that, because also, for example, in Slovenia, we are still not that far in that regard. But a month ago, the union, food delivery workers that work for these platforms actually began organizing and formed a trade union actually, and demanded all these things for so to be employed, to get the rights of the employed people, etc., etc. But of course, the platform does not want to hear anything about that, and they do not recognize neither the trade union nor that they are actually employing them, but are only hiring them through contracts, of course. So there are some tensions also going on here in this field.
And the problem is, platforms are a bit elusive. You don't know who is the person, who is the employer. There are no faces to speak to. So it's a very complicated subject, you know. There are no hierarchies. There are subcontracting schemes and all that. So it's very tricky.
It is true, but we can only hope that these legislation changes and also some infrastructural changes, so as the organization of these workers could lead to improvement of their working and living conditions, of course.
Yeah, with the European directive, one way or another, we'll have to have national legislation about it, okay? And follow some principles regarding that, but there's always options within national contexts to play a little.
Yes.
With that. It depends on documents, it depends on ideological trends, all that.
Of course. To end with this, we really hope that, of course, we know that the European Union idea of directives is far from ideal, and that there is always a necessary mobilization in order to achieve improvements in working and living conditions. But nevertheless, I think that we are just around 1 hour time of our talk, and I believe that we covered most of the topics.
I think so.
I think that we're very efficient and very, very strict to the topic. I would really like to thank you. It was a huge pleasure to host you, and it was great to hear some new and different insights from Portugal. I hope that you enjoyed it.
Yes, very much.
And just to let our viewers know, this was the penultimate podcast, and see you in 3 months with the concluding one about the entire research and the crucial findings. So that would be all. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Pošast trga, podkast o kapitalizmu, državi in alternativah.